Good technical director.
Uh-huh.
Good technical director.
Yeah. I was thinking when we were singing what we should do is put that
Yeah.
speaker inside the piano and just give an old lady $25 to sit there and make it feel real, right? Okay, if you have your Bibles, let's go back to James chapter 1, which we'll see. I was hoping to try and finish chapter 1 next week in this discussion we've been having in regard to trials. That may happen. We'll see how the day goes. James chapter 1, all about trials. We've been discussing a great deal about trials. And today, we get to shift gears a little bit in his discussion. I really like this. As I said, we've talked a great deal in this study about how we're supposed to properly respond to trials. And basically, we are, James says in verse 2, to consider them a source of joy. That's the basic sort of overarching thought in regard to how to respond. But he goes on to explain some other things. The only way we're going to be able to do that is when we understand the truth about our trials, he says following that statement. And that is, they are sent by a loving Father as a gift, as we will discuss a bit more in a moment. And they have a design behind them. They are designed both to prove the quality of our faith and to mature us spiritually. Two very important things that he wants to do in our life. That is, trials are sent by God as a blessing to further conform us to the image of Christ. Then James goes on to teach, starting in about verse 4 or 5, that we're going to need to sort of possess some certain qualities to do what he's instructing us to do. One of these things is wisdom. Wisdom. James says if you need wisdom, ask. God will give you wisdom. Wisdom, remember, was defined as a skill to be able to see things from God's perspective and then live from that perspective. The trial itself will try to present you a whole different reality. But you can't give in to that. You have to see what's going on from God's perspective and then live that way, no matter what the circumstances are like. Not only do we need wisdom, but we saw last week that during our trials, we will need the ability to boast, he said. Not just endure our trials, not just get through our trials, but to glory in them, to take pride in them, to use them as an opportunity to show off what God is able to do in our lives with what he's given us. And so if we can possess those qualities and keep that perspective and commit to endure, that's our part. Commit to endure. We can live through our trials in such a way as honors God and glorifies God and brings about the end that he sent them to accomplish. So James has had a lot to say about how to do trials God's way, as well he should. But, there are other ways of dealing with trials rather than just joyously enduring them as we're instructed to do. And so my question is, well, what happens if you don't? What happens if a trial comes along in your life and you ignore James's instruction? You consider it something other than a joyous gift sent by God, and you do not allow it to prove your faith or to perfect you spiritually. What happens if you don't go to God for wisdom and you don't glory in the opportunity you've been given in your circumstances? Well, the short answer is that you fail in what the trial was sent to accomplish. It doesn't accomplish what it was sent for, and what that may mean is the trial's going to have to continue until it does accomplish it. It may have to get worse until it does accomplish it. or another one may have to come to accomplish the same thing. Because one of the awesome things about God is He isn't going to give up on what He has determined to do in the lives of His children, and that's conform you to the image of Christ. And it's going to happen, whether it happens painfully or joyfully. And that's sort of on you. And so, while that prospect of additional or prolonged suffering is bad enough, there's an even worse possibility that can happen when we fail to face our trials God's way. And that possibility is we can actually fall into sin as a result of the trial. Not so much as a result of the trial, but as a result of the way we choose to handle it. You see, trials have this unique characteristic about them that other things don't have. And that is, if you fail to handle them as instructed, they can quickly turn from a source of joy and blessing and spiritual growth to just the opposite, into an opportunity for you to sin. And so how does a trial, which God sent for our good, become a temptation instead? How does it go from a source of joy to a source of sin, and what happens to us when it does? Well, that's what James begins to touch on starting in verse 12. And that's where we'll begin today. He says this: "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. Each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of His own will He brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of His creatures." When trials turn to temptations, is James' sort of thought in the passage we just read. Now I want to start out by point out to begin with in verse 12 that James starts out this idea of trials sort of morphing into temptations, if you will, by giving us something in verse 12. He sort of says two things. He gives us a reminder, and then he gives us a promise. Okay? Look at what he says in verse 12. Here's the reminder. Blessed is the man who endures temptation. Now, we've already seen that's pretty much what James's kind of thought has been starting in verse 2 up to this point. We understand that if you will choose to endure temptation, which is what we are instructed to do, that's the way we're told to handle our trials, is by enduring them. James reminds us, if you will endure your trial, you will be blessed. So there's the reminder before he gets to the sort of bad part, right? The hard part. Blessed is the man who endures his temptations. He says, because when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life. That, or in other words, James is saying, if you will, as I have instructed you, endure your trial, instead of giving up or taking some other road, you will end up blessed. And you will ultimately receive the crown, which is life. Enduring your trial, in accordance to the way James has instructed us to do, is the only way you're going to experience happiness in it. That word blessed, you hear often people, preachers, and they're not wrong, say, well, you kind of think of that word as meaning happy, and that's not untrue. There's more to it than that, right? But what James is saying is the only road to happiness, the only road to sort of joy, the only path to doing this at all is going to be if you choose endurance. And if you will do that long enough, you will end up receiving life as your crown. So James starts with a reminder. Then in verse 12 he jumps to the promise. The one who continues to endure will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love Him. Those who are enduring are going to receive a crown of life as a reward. There is a reward And this is sort of big picture stuff, so I'll try to simplify it-ish, right? What James is doing is reminding us is choosing to endure your trial is not a dead end. There's a goal to doing that. And the goal is the reward, and the reward is life here. James says the crown of life. The crown is life. That's the reward. That's what you're trying to get to by continuing to endure your trial. In James' day, Rome ruled the world. Athletics was a very important part of their society and culture, just like it is in modern America today, right? We all know about the Stanley Cup and the Lombardi Trophy and the whatever the baseball and the basketball one is, right? These rewards. These athletes will endure having to eat well, having to sleep right, having to work out, and having to play and win and struggle. They'll endure anything they have to endure to get to the end of the season to do what? Hoist that trophy. Well, it was no different in James' day. Except what these winning athletes in James' day would get was a crown, what's called a crown. Basically, it was typically leaves woven together and placed on the head of the victor. And so it was what it represented that was important, not the fact that it was some leaves stuck on their head. But James' idea is the same for us. Everywhere in the Bible, life, that is eternal life, is promised to those who endure. That's the reward. That's the crown. If you don't turn away, if you don't go back in the middle, you will receive life. Everywhere in the Bible, that thought is consistent. Luke chapter 21 and verse 19, Jesus says this, "Stand firm and you will win life." That's why we do it. That's why we continue. That's why we endure. There's something waiting on us. 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul says this of himself, and I'm just giving you the references. We don't have time to read them. 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul says this, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith, and now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day." One more real quick, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 36 and 39. You need to persevere. That's how he starts the sentence, the writer of Hebrews. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. We do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. Now, I bring all that up to remind you what James is reminding us of in verse 12, because he's about to get to something very nasty in verse 13. And that promise and that reminder is there to cause you to remember, before he has to turn to the discussion in verse 13, that everywhere in the Bible, life is promised as a reward only for those who continue to endure. Only for those who continue to endure. Those who turn back do not receive a reward. They do not receive a crown. They do not receive life. As Jesus himself said, Matthew chapter 24, he who endures to the end, the same will be saved. And endurance is exactly what James has been talking about. He has been encouraging us since verse 2. When a trial comes along in your life, accept it joyfully and then stay with it until it does what it needs to do. Don't stop. Don't give up. Don't turn around. Don't let it turn you around. And there's a reason. Because that's the only way you can choose to handle the trial. That's, number one, going to cause it to accomplish what it was sent to accomplish. And number two, going to give you any strength to get through the thing that it was that you're facing. This is the only path you can choose that leads to blessing, is endurance. But what if you don't? What if you choose something else? Well, that's what James starts tackling in verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. What happens when you are sent a trial by God and you choose any other path than endurance, any other path, is you are eventually going to get tired of it. Your strength, your fleshly strength is going to give out. Your fleshly wisdom is going to fail you. Your ability is going to give out underneath the weight of what you're suffering. Eventually that's going to happen. And when that happens, that trial is going to change from a source of blessing and joy to a source of temptation to sin. And here's the way it happens. When your trial gets too difficult for you to continue, complaining is likely to start. Complaining about what I'm going through, right? It may start small like that. Just the temptation to complain instead of to pray. The temptation is to woe is me instead of glory to God. And complaining will lead to rebellion, will lead to sin, will lead to disobedience, all these sorts of things. In other words, this trial that was originally sent to bless you, as James says in verse 12, is going to become a source of potential sin in your life if you choose anything besides endurance. That's what he means when he's talking about verse 12. Let me show you what's neat about this. We're going to look at a bunch of words here real quick. Actually, they're all the same word, but I want to point out that they're different in the English version of the Bible. Let's go all the way back to verse 2. Look at how he starts. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. You see that word trials in verse 2? Keep your eye on that one, or underline it, or whatever you do, the way you take notes. Trials in verse 2. Let's look in verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptation. You see that word temptation in verse 12? Keep your eye on that one too. Look in verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, nor does he tempt any. 4 times in one verse. And then in verse 14, each one of us is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. You know why I'm pointing all those words out to you? Because they're all the same word in Greek. Trials, test, temptation, that's English. When James wrote it, it was all one word. Now, what's important about that? You see, a trial can be a test. A trial can be a temptation. A temptation can be a trial. A temptation can be a test. A test can be a temptation. James's point is, it's all one thing. But what determines your experience with it is how you react. A trial stays a trial if you continue to endure. But what happens when you start to falter? What happens when you start to fail? What's happened when you start to get me-centered? You start to complain and groan. What happens when you start to buckle under it instead of glorifying God, instead of seeking His wisdom, instead of using it to boast in His glory, right? What happens when that temptation you start handling another way? Or that trial, I mean. It quits being a trial and it starts being a temptation. And that's James's point in using that same word over and over and over with all these different shades of meaning. He is trying to express to you, if you choose any road besides endurance, you're going to end up in sin. Because we cannot handle in our flesh, in and of ourselves, with our own wisdom, with our own strength, we can't handle the trials that God sends in our life to perfect us. It's not possible for us to handle them. That's by design. He doesn't want us to. He wants to do it. And when we start trying to do it any way besides joyfully enduring, your trial is really going to change. rapidly in nature from a trial sent by God that's a blessing to a temptation to sin that's a curse. You know the only thing that changed? Your mind. It went from being one thing to being the opposite thing without changing at all. It was you that changed. Your perspective. The commitment you had to stick it out, to handle it a certain way. When that changes, your trial quits being a trial and it starts being a temptation. Now look what James says in verse 13. I love this. No one can say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God. Here's why that's cool. Because what would happen is this. When God sends a trial and we're doing what James says, we're joyfully enduring it. Okay? And we're going along, and then that stops and we start handling it some other way. You know what the chief complaint becomes? Him. I can't believe you're doing this to me. You. Right? And what James is saying here is no one can say when they're being tempted, I'm being tempted by God. Because first of all, God didn't send you a temptation. He sent you a trial. You turned it into a temptation by the way you failed to do what James told you to do. So God doesn't send temptation into your life, and this thing that He sent was never intended to be that. If this thing that has that God sent into your life has got you off into sin, that's what you did with it, not what God sent it to do. And so nobody can say when God sends them a trial, well, you know what? I wouldn't be like this if God hadn't done this to me. You can't say that. You did that to yourself. Very much like our Sunday school lesson this morning, right? Very much like our Sunday school lesson. And so what James is saying here is if your trial becomes a temptation, instead you did that to yourself. You failed to endure. You failed to seek God's wisdom. You failed to glory in what was happening to you, and you started handling that trial your way. And what happened is it went from a trial to a temptation, and you failed. And that ain't God's fault. That's on you. Because I told you how to handle it. You chose to do otherwise. And this is what James says when he goes on through verse 14, 15, 16. He says, you're tempted when you're drawn away by your own lust and enticed. That was you. God sent a trial. He meant it for good. He meant it for blessing. We're about to see how I know that in just a moment. And you didn't do what I told you to do, and now you're in sin. Now your trial is a burden. Now you're suffering. Now there's no joy in your situation. Now there's no hope in your situation. Now you're miserable. Now you're complaining. Now your trial is making everybody around you miserable. You chose to do something besides endure, and now your trial has got you in sin instead of in a place of blessing, which is what it was sent to do. And so it's all about how you choose to handle it. When a trial comes into your life, if we do, once again, sort of my main thought for the day, if you do anything besides what James has said, this is where you're going to end up. And listen, I get it. I fail all the time. Big ways and small. We all do. So I get it. I get how when something comes into your life and it's difficult and it just drags on and on and on, it gets harder and harder and harder to bear up under, right? I get all that. And it's easy to replace joy and glory to God with complaining and bitterness and doubt. But if you do that, you're going to leave the place of blessing and end up in sin. And what God intended to do was good stuff. To bless you and to give you the opportunity to earn that crown of life. And look what we see in verse 16 and 17. How do I know this? How do I know that God sent your trial out of love? How do I know that He sent it to be a blessing? What does James say in verse 16 and 17? Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. I love how he starts with that. Do not fool yourself. God is one God and He's one way. He didn't send this to cause you to sin. He can't even do that. So one of the things he can't do is tempt you to sin. So don't be fooled. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Let me focus on that for just a second in verse 17. Look at what James is calling your trial in verse 17. A good and perfect gift. Remember our context? It's trials. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about the gifts of God in general. I mean, it's still true, but that's not what James is talking about. He's referencing your trial. James is saying your trial, when it was handed to you from God, that was a good gift. It was perfect. And it came from a Father who loves you. And I love how James says, he calls him the Father of lights. He says there's no variation. No one's 1,000,000% sure what that means, but that's thought to be sort of a Jewish saying about God. We know what it's about, even though we don't know where it came from. What it means is God doesn't change. He's more reliable than the sun and the moon. He's the one that made them. And He's not going to be one way one day and different the next day. And in the context of James' discussion here, what he's saying is He didn't hand you an opportunity to sin because God doesn't change. The same God that loved you and saved you, put His Son on the cross for you, exchanged your sin for righteousness, that's the God that brought the trial into your life. Not some different schizophrenic God who loved you one day and was mad at you the next. God doesn't, that's not in His nature and character. And what James says is this thing, this trial that came to you, when God handed it to you, it was a gift. And it was good. And it was perfect. And it came from an unchanging Father whose only design is to bless you. If your trial has become an opportunity to sin, you did that to yourself. Because God gave you a gift. You just didn't do what He said with the gift He gave you. And that's what happens when we try and handle the trials God sends us any other way besides what James tells us. You cannot hold up. We are flesh and blood. It's not possible. You can't maintain. You don't have that kind of strength. You don't have that kind of wisdom. None of us do. Even the best of us. You can't hold up. And when you fail to hold up, eventually that joy is going to turn to sorrow, and that glory is going to turn to complaining, and that's going to eventually lead to rebellion. And what does James say? Sin eventually ultimately brings death. Not a crown of life, but death. And that's sort of a glimpse into the alternative universe, if you will, of trials. In the perfect world, here's how they go. God gives me a trial. I receive it joyfully. I commit to endure. I need help. I go to Him. I get help. And the trial does what it was sent to do. That's the design. But in the alternative universe of sin and self, the trial comes. I don't handle it well. I may start out okay. It doesn't stay that way. I eventually get tired. I eventually get hurt. I eventually get burnt out. I start complaining about God. I start blaming God. It doesn't end with a crown of life. It ends with me in sin. That's the potential danger. And James includes this in this discussion to remind us, right? If you're a child of God, trials are inevitable. It's how He designed the growth process. But if you choose to handle it any way besides what James is instructed to do, this thing is going to end as a sinful burden in your life. And it is liable, it's possible, it's distinctly possible for it to cause you to give up completely and just walk away. Just walk away. That is the ugly truth about the alternative to doing what James says here. And so how do we ensure, when God sends us these trials, that we stay on the right road? Well, you already know. I've been preaching about it for weeks. James has told us everything there is to say about it, nearly, right? You just commit to endure. And when it gets hard, you recommit to endure. And when you don't understand how to do that, you go and ask God for wisdom. And when you don't know what else to do, you give Him glory because He loves you enough to have sent you this thing. If you think about it from that perspective, talk about changing the way you think of your trials. That God would love you enough. The unchanging God would love you enough to hand you something so difficult and so meaningful that you're going to have to completely and utterly rely on Him to be able to walk through it. That's a good thing. That's a gift. That's an absolute gift. Do not allow it to turn into anything else by choosing to walk your own way in the midst of it. That's the message here in this brief passage. Lord's will, next week we'll try and probably come close to finishing chapter 1 because he sort of has some connected thoughts beginning in verse 19 that touch on sort of what he said here about the temptation stuff. And we'll see basically what he's going to say. You know what you need to do for the rest of this trial? You just need to listen, be quiet. But we'll get to that, Lord's will, next week. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll dismiss. Father, we